Thanks for your talk, Kathrin. I have two questions, the first one kind of leading into the second. The first one is, given this social contract view, I'm wondering how implicit this is or how maybe easily it's seen in the early dialogues that would give us reason to think that the Athenian jurors would know that Socrates had this kind of social contract view. Because if so, it would kind of push back against the idea that they even had a perception of him as a political threat if they knew that he thought of himself as having this duty to the Athenian laws as they were. So I'm wondering about that. And then that leads into my second question, which is you mentioned the religious aspect of this. And we haven't had any questions about that. So I'm wondering how much emphasis there is in the trial about seeing him as a religious threat and whether or not you think that ties in also with the political threat or if that's a distinct issue.
Yeah, really good questions. There's a real question as to how much a mainstream Athenian really would have known about the philosophical views that Plato ascribes to Socrates. My guess is not very much. I didn't mention this in this talk, but in Plato's Apology, Socrates is seen as defending himself against what he calls the earlier accusers, and that's the charges that are leveled against him as a result of the comedies of Aristophanes, which were performed, over 20 years before he died. But I think it's plausible to think that the mainstream view of Socrates that was common among the Athenians would have been, to a large extent, based on these sort of caricatures that they had seen in Aristophanes, where he was portrayed. It's sort of an amalgam of lots of views that the Platonic Socrates doesn't have. In Aristophanes, he's an atheist. He acts like a sophist, so he tries to make the weaker argument stronger. He is interested in things that the pre-Socratic philosophers were interested in, which the Platonic Socrates, he tells us in the Phaedo that he used to be interested in these things, but at the point at which we meet him, he no longer cares about cosmology and things like that at all. He's just interested in the moral virtues. So I think to your first question, how subtle would have been the understanding of a mainstream Athenian of the philosophical views that are attributed to Socrates by Plato? My answer to that is not very subtle. That connects also to the Euthyphro issue. Some people, like Bernier, says this, and also to your second question. Bernier reads the trial of Socrates in this way, that we should think that we should take what I've called the moral religious interpretation. We should take the view that the Athenians took him to be so dangerous because of his moral religious views, and in particular, the point he makes in the Euthyphro, that even the gods are bound by a higher moral law. That mainstream Athenians would have known about this, and that they would have understood it to a sufficient extent that they thought he deserved to die because of that. That they found his objection to a divine command theory to be so offensive that alone accounts for his death. And it just does not strike me as very plausible that mainstream Athenians would have been aware of this philosophical position, or the other ones we find in Plato.
Just one quick
I mean, there's still so much to say about the moral religious interpretation, so we would have to get into what kind of conception of piety the ancients had at that time, and what conception of religion and so forth, and I didn't try to say anything about that in this talk, but I think that's a really interesting topic. My own reading is that something that I would try to advance something very similar to what I argued for in connection with political interpretation, namely that perhaps they thought he posed a threat to mainstream Athenian conceptions of piety, but if so, then they were confused about what his views in fact were, at least based on Plato's dialogue. So I think it's fairly clear that he wasn't an atheist. I mean, he devoted his entire life to serving the god Apollo. So in Plato's Apology, there's a section where he engages Miletus in a Socratic cross-examination, and the issue seems to be that he's trying to defend himself against charges of atheism. But I take that to be very implausible. So maybe he had a non-standard conception of the gods as bound by a higher moral law, as being able to communicate with him personally through this inner voice, the daimonion. So these are certainly unusual things that not every mainstream Athenian would have believed, but I don't think that any of these beliefs would have been sufficient to get him killed.
And then just really quick, another part of the question I'd asked, which I hope we can touch on a little bit more, is how much the two overlap, and even within the early dialogues, how much do Socrates' political views overlap with his religious views, or are they fairly distinct things both in the trial and in the dialogues? Or do they interact? I mean, they could be distinct, but do his religious views affect his political views or vice versa, if they do?
I don't see how we would.
Just a point about the two explanations that we've been talking about, the political interpretation versus the religious interpretation of Socrates' death. It seems that these aren't mutually exclusive, right? So it seems that you could have, for example, have charges brought against him because of political motivations, but then most of the jurors disliked him or voted against him because they thought he was impious, for example. Or it could be that some jurors thought he was impious, others thought that he was anti-democratic. And so it seemed that there might be room for a more nuanced explanation.
Well, I take those who subscribe to the political interpretation to want to say that mainly accounts. So whatever else may have been going on, that mainly accounts for why he died, or maybe exclusively, although they may not want to go that far. But I think it's a claim about what we should put the emphasis on. So there are lots of relevant factors, but what should we put the emphasis on?
Well, oddly enough, my question is almost exactly the same as the two that we just had. And I was sort of worried about the nature of the project in the sense that once you give one explanation for something like this, it looks like you're barking up the wrong tree, because there are going to be countless explanations. So here we have political, some kind of ethical, ideological, some religious kind of a thing. It reminded me of, there's this little schoolboy joke about the causes of the First World War. So what are the causes of the First World War? And you learn in school something, well, it's very simple. Of course, in the UK, we ultimately learned it was, the lunatic Kaiser Wilhelm. Ultimately, of course, this is ridiculous as an answer to the question, because it's a massive, complex sort of a confluence of different things. And so I was wondering, in this case, we've got many accusers, we've got many jurors, so we presumably just have many motivations and many possible reasons. And in fact, I suppose I've said nothing much more. And in some ways, the previous two questions just points that they just made. But I think I'm myself very hesitant about how well fundamentally it was this. And after all, if you wanted a fundamentally one, of course, the only accusation that Socrates really has difficulty answering is precisely the one about disbelieving the gods of the city. Mm-hmm. Because he seems to be guilty as charged. So I think it's just that whatever the explanation or set of explanations is, it's going to be very complex. So I find the project, to that extent, rather troubling or puzzling.
Well, yeah, it's very complex. I agree with that. I mean, in a way, your question, I think, raises skepticism about any sort of historical enterprise.
Yes, it does. That's true.
Any historian interested in, for example, what caused, the Second World War is going to have to deal with a similar situation, that we just have a multitude of relevant factors. But out of these, you have to construct a coherent story, and that story will consist in saying, well, even though all of these things were relevant, I'm going to tell a story in terms of this series of events, right? And so I take this to be similar in nature.